What I am about to explain will fundamentally change how you understand the war unfolding in the Persian Gulf right now. And more directly, it will change how you understand what is about to happen to your gas bill, your grocery prices, and the trajectory of the global economy for the next 18 months. The coverage you have seen on every major network treats Kharg Island as a location on a map, a military target, a talking point for retired generals on cable panels. That framing is not just incomplete. It is structurally incapable of showing you what Kharg Island actually is. What it is, and what I will demonstrate by the end of this analysis, is a geographic mechanism that converts superpower military dominance into superpower economic hemorrhage. The mechanism has a name. It is called a concentration of force inversion trap. And by the time you understand how it works, you will see that the country spending $891 million a day on Operation Epic Fury is not the country winning this conflict. It is the country being bled. Let me give you the numbers that the headlines consistently fail to contextualize. Kharg Island is a coral outcrop 25 kilometers off the southern coast of Iran in the northern Persian Gulf. It is roughly the size of a small university campus, and 94% of Iran's entire crude oil export volume flows through it. According to Kepler Maritime data, that translates to approximately 1.52 million barrels per day passing through a single terminal loaded onto very large crude carriers that can only dock there. Because Kharg sits in naturally deep water that most of Iran's shallow coastline cannot offer. The terminal holds 31 million barrels in storage capacity. As of early March, inventory stood at 18 million barrels, 58% full. This is not a minor facility. This is the fiscal spine of the Iranian state. Iran's alternative export terminal at Jaz on the Gulf of Oman has a theoretical pipeline capacity of 1 million barrels per day. Its effective throughput is closer to 300,000. That means Iran's backup system can replace roughly 20% of Kharg's output. In functional terms, Kharg is irreplaceable. Now, here is what that geographic concentration actually produces strategically. And this is the part that transforms the entire logic of the conflict. On the 13th of March 2026, President Trump posted that U.S. forces had struck military installations on Kharg Island while deliberately leaving oil infrastructure untouched. That statement was not a display of restraint. It was an admission of structural constraint. The United States did not spare KRG's oil facilities because it chose mercy. It spared them because destroying those facilities would detonate a global energy crisis that would punish Washington more than Tehran. Brent crude had already surged nearly 60% since the start of Operation Epic Fury, crossing $114 per barrel within the first week. Neil Quill at Chatham House stated directly that an attack on Kharg's oil infrastructure would push prices toward $150 per barrel, 20 million barrels per day transit the Strait of Hormuz. 84% of that crude is bound for Asian markets. A sustained disruption at Kharg does not merely affect Iran. It detonates a repricing event across the entire global energy supply chain. This is the concentration of force inversion trap. It operates on a principle that most military analysts discuss in classified settings, but rarely explain to the public. When a single geographic node controls a disproportionate share of a critical global commodity, the attacking power faces a paradox. The node is militarily vulnerable. A carrier strike group can neutralize Kharg's loading infrastructure in hours. But the economic consequences of that neutralization radiate outward through every oil importing economy on Earth. And they return to the attacking power's own domestic economy in the form of gasoline prices, food inflation, transport costs, and voter anger. The attacker has the capability to destroy the node. The attacker lacks the capacity to absorb the consequences of destroying it. That is the inversion. Military strength converts into economic self-harm, and the defender, Iran, does not need to protect Kharg successfully. Iran only needs the threat of KG's disruption to remain credible. And here is where it gets genuinely dangerous. The cost structure of this conflict is not merely unfavorable for the United States. It is inverted at a ratio that has no precedent in modern American military operations. The Center for Strategic and International Studies has published sequential cost estimates for Operation Epic Fury. The first 100 hours cost $3.7 billion. By day 6, the Pentagon reported to Congress that total expenditures have reached $11.3 billion. By day 12, CSIS estimated $16.5 billion. That is $891 million per day. On the other side of the ledger, Iran is deploying Shahed series drones that cost approximately $30,000 per unit. The United States is intercepting those drones with defensive systems that cost $2 million per intercept. That is a 66-to-1 cost ratio in Iran's favor. THAAD interceptor missiles used against Iranian ballistic launches cost $12.8 million each. Iran does not need to penetrate American defenses to win the cost war. Iran only needs to force the United States to keep firing. Every interception is a transfer of wealth from the U.S. Treasury to the physics of attrition. But here's the part that most people never hear explained. This cost asymmetry is not an accident. It is an engineered strategic outcome that Iran has refined over 4 decades. During the tanker war of 1984 to 1988, Iraq launched repeated airstrikes against Kharg Island using French-built Exocet missiles. The attacks damaged loading jetties, hit tankers, and disrupted export schedules. Iran adapted. It shifted partial export flows to Larak and Siri Island terminals. It developed shuttle tanker systems to move crude under fire. It learned at enormous cost that Kharg's geographic concentration was both its greatest economic asset and its greatest strategic vulnerability. The lesson Thrawn extracted from that 8-year war was not how to make KRG invulnerable. It was how to make KRG's vulnerability useful. If the world depends on Kharg's output remaining online, then threatening Kharg becomes a form of leverage that Iran can exercise without ever firing a shot at it. The island does not need to be defended. It needs to be threatening enough to defend itself through the fear of its loss. This is precisely where Western analysts consistently get it wrong. The conversation in Washington's hawkish policy circles about seizing Kharg treats the island as a strategic prize. Charbel Onto at the defense post laid out the logic directly. Occupying Kharg would lock the United States into defending a small exposed outpost against a determined regional adversary operating on its own doorstep. The island sits within range of Iranian anti-H ship missiles, coastal artillery, naval mines, fast attack boats, and drone swarms launched from the mainland just 18 miles away. Every resupply mission would transit contested waters. Every defensive interceptor fired over Kharg would be one less available for protecting regional bases in Qatar, Bahrain, or the UAE. Iran does not need to retake the island. It only needs to make holding it so expensive that the garrison becomes a net strategic liability. Proxy forces across the region compound the cost further. Howie forces in Yemen, Shia militias in Iraq, and residual Hezbollah networks in Lebanon each possess the capacity to stretch the American battle space across thousands of miles simultaneously. Russia and China have every incentive to feed Tehran intelligence, replacement drones, and targeting data. Their objective is not Iranian victory. Their objective is American exhaustion. Now, let us run the numbers because this is where it becomes your problem directly. Brent crude sits near $15 per barrel as of this week. That is a 60% increase from pre-conflict levels. But crude price is only the top of the transmission chain. The Energy Information Administration reports that 84% of crude transiting the Strait of Hormuz flows to Asian markets. India is the most exposed major importer. Indian refinery sources indicate actual fuel inventory coverage of 20 to 25 days, despite official claims of 74 days. A sustained Hormuz disruption does not give India 2.5 months of buffer. It gives India 3 weeks before fuel rationing becomes a political crisis in a nation of 1.4 billion people. Japan holds strategic petroleum reserves covering 254 days. South Korea holds 28 days. China's reserves are estimated at 900 million barrels, roughly 3 months of imports. These numbers create a hierarchy of pain. India breaks first. Southeast Asian economies follow. China absorbs the shock longest, but at the cost of drawing down reserves that Beijing considers a core strategic asset, and none of this stays in Asia. The LSE Business Review analysis published on March 12th stated it explicitly. A short closure of Hormuz is an oil shock, but a long closure becomes an inflation and growth shock that transmits through diesel prices, freight costs, aviation fuel, shipping insurance premiums, and inflation expectations across every economy on Earth. What does that mean at your kitchen table? In the 1973 oil embargo, the resulting price shock did more than disrupt energy markets. It initiated a prolonged period of stagflation that reshaped the U.S. economic landscape for years. Over roughly 4 years, real household purchasing power declined significantly, with estimates often citing losses in the range of double-digit percentages. The current disruption, however, operates within a fundamentally different global structure. Spare production capacity is thinner, global demand is more tightly coupled, strategic petroleum reserves are comparatively smaller relative to total consumption, and the financial system is far more leveraged than it was in the early 1970s. These differences matter because they compress the margin for error. A prolonged disruption to a critical energy choke point would not merely register as a regional event. It would transmit rapidly through interconnected markets. If a major disruption were to persist for 90 days, policymakers, particularly at institutions like the Federal Reserve, would face an increasingly constrained policy dilemma. On one side lies the risk of tolerating elevated energy-driven inflation, potentially exceeding 6%, which would erode real incomes and destabilize price expectations. On the other side lies the risk of tightening monetary policy into an already fragile economic environment shaped by uncertainty, supply chain volatility, and geopolitical stress. In such a scenario, macroeconomic variables that individuals typically consider personal mortgage rates, grocery prices, fuel costs, and retirement portfolio valuations become directly sensitive to geopolitical developments. These are not peripheral effects. They are primary transmission channels through which energy shocks propagate into everyday economic life. From a systems perspective, the situation can be understood as a branching set of strategic outcomes, each with distinct economic and geopolitical consequences. In the first scenario, the United States continues an air campaign without physically occupying the critical infrastructure in question. In this case, Iran may absorb damage to its military assets such as air defense systems, missile infrastructure, and command and control nodes while maintaining the operational integrity of its primary export capacity. Under such conditions, global oil markets would likely remain under pressure, with prices stabilizing in a high but volatile range as supply remains constrained by uncertainty rather than fully disrupted. Meanwhile, the cost of sustaining extended military operations could escalate into tens of billions of dollars per month without a decisive mechanism to compel a change in Iranian strategic behavior, given that its primary revenue stream remains intact. In a second scenario, targeted strikes escalate to the point where critical oil infrastructure is significantly degraded or destroyed. This will likely trigger an immediate and sharp repricing in global energy markets, with crude oil potentially spiking to levels far above current baselines within a short time frame. Such a shock would not remain confined to energy markets. It would cascade through transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, and logistics, increasing input costs across industries. The resulting inflationary pressure could contribute to a broader global economic slowdown or recession. Additionally, retaliatory responses targeting regional energy infrastructure could amplify disruptions, particularly in neighboring Gulf economies, further compounding market instability. A third scenario involves an attempt to physically seize and hold strategically important infrastructure. While such an operation might achieve initial tactical success, it would introduce a persistent and costly occupation dynamic. The holding force would operate in a contested environment, exposed to asymmetric tactics such as drone strikes, missile attacks, and irregular warfare. Over time, this transforms the conflict from a short-term air campaign into a sustained logistical and defensive commitment. Iran, in turn, would not need to reclaim the territory directly. Instead, it could focus on imposing continuous operational and financial costs through attritional pressure. The asymmetry in cost structures becomes decisive here, as defensive systems deployed by the United States often carry significantly higher per unit costs than the relatively inexpensive offensive systems used in asymmetric warfare. The divergence in victory conditions between the two sides further clarifies the structural imbalance. For the United States, a successful outcome may require not only neutralizing specific military capabilities, but also achieving broader strategic objectives such as limiting regional influence or curbing nuclear development. For Iran, by contrast, the primary objective is survival and the preservation of regime stability. This asymmetry means that one side requires a decisive resolution, while the other can sustain a prolonged engagement through endurance. In such contexts, endurance itself becomes a strategic asset, particularly when it is supported by lower-cost, scalable tactics. Historically, similar dynamics have been observed in prolonged conflicts where military superiority did not translate into strategic success. The Soviet experience in Afghanistan between 1979 and 1989 illustrates how extended military commitments can impose cumulative economic and political burdens that ultimately exceed the benefits of engagement. In that case, the conflict contributed to long-term fiscal strain and resource allocation challenges that affected the broader Soviet system. The lesson is not that geography alone determines outcomes, but that the interaction between geography, cost structures, and strategic objectives can produce outcomes where operational control does not equate to strategic victory. In financial markets, Several indicators can provide early signals of shifting conditions. One such indicator is the behavior of war risk premiums in maritime insurance markets. Institutions such as Lloyd's of London play a key role in underwriting these risks. When war risk surcharges on tanker traffic rise significantly, crossing certain thresholds relative to vessel value, commercial shipping operators may begin to self-adjust by rerouting, delaying, or reducing exposure to affected regions, regardless of official government positions. This market-driven response can precede formal policy changes and serves as an important real-time signal of perceived risk. Similarly, energy futures markets offer insight into expectations of disruption. A sustained premium in near-term crude contracts relative to longer-dated contracts often reflects concerns about immediate supply constraints rather than temporary volatility. Monitoring the structure of these price curves can provide a forward-looking view of how markets are pricing geopolitical risk. In parallel, activity at alternative export terminals, shifts in regional shipping flows, and changes in reserve utilization rates can indicate whether major producers are preparing contingency pathways in anticipation of potential disruptions. Ultimately, the broader implication is that modern geopolitical conflicts are no longer confined to discrete battlefields. They are embedded within global systems of energy distribution, financial intermediation, and trade logistics. In such an environment, localized disruptions can propagate rapidly across borders and sectors, influencing everything from inflation trajectories to industrial output. Understanding these dynamics requires not only tracking military developments, but also interpreting the economic signals that reflect how markets anticipate and adapt to risk. The key takeaway is not simply that energy choke points matter, but that their importance is magnified in a highly interconnected global economy. Observing insurance rates, futures pricing, shipping behavior, and reserve management provides a framework for interpreting the evolving situation in real time. These indicators do not require access to classified information. Rather, they reflect the collective assessment of risk by participants who are directly exposed to its consequences.